In the dim glow of a flickering bunker light, Staff Sergeant Walter Reed hunched over a steel radio console deep beneath the airfields of southern England. The year was 1943, and the skies above were a violent blur of propeller engines and flak bursts. Reed's fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of responsibility. Every crackle through the headphones could mean a downed pilot, a new flight command, or worse, enemy interception. This was no ordinary radio station. Hidden behind the mundane walls of a communications center lay one of the most ambitious secret projects of the Allied Air Command, a new airborne signal network that would soon transform the future of military aviation. Just hours earlier, a B-17 squadron en route to a bombing raid over Hamburg had vanished from the radar. Visibility was near zero, and standard signal relays were being jammed. Reed, a former Bell Labs technician drafted into service, had been assigned to monitor an experimental frequency modulation system known only as Echolink. It was supposed to bypass German jammers and guide aircraft using short-burst encrypted signals, something never tried mid-battle. The technology was crude, the margin of error thin. But tonight, it was the only thing standing between silence and salvation. Back in Washington, few knew how far this project had come. Born from British signal intelligence and American engineering, Echolink was originally intended to solve a simple problem: coordination. Too many Allied planes had been lost, not to enemy fire, but to confusion, squadrons drifting off course, radio blackouts, misread orders. The generals needed something revolutionary. What they got was a prototype that operated outside standard AM bands, bounced across low-altitude repeaters, and used pre-coded bursts instead of open chatter. In the field, it was a gamble. In Reed's hands, it was their only shot. Static surged through his headset, followed by a faint pulse. 3 blips. Reed's eyes widened. That was the emergency ping from Eagle 1. A pilot was still alive, still trying to make contact through the storm. He adjusted the dial carefully, sweating through his wool uniform, every click of the knob bringing the signal into focus. This is Eagle 1. Low fuel. Instrument failure. Need guide. Over. The voice was broken, but real. Reed immediately reached for the override panel. The experiment was no longer just a test. It had become a rescue. Outside, the wind howled against the bunker's blast doors, and the shadow of a bomber flickered against the rain-slick concrete. Reed keyed the transmitter and engaged the directional guidance system. Eagle 1, maintain heading 090. Follow beacon pulse. We've got you. It was a cold and calculated instruction, but behind his words was something deeper. Hope. A silent belief that this system, this unproven wartime gamble, could work. And as the signal cleared and the faint hum of propellers grew louder in the distance, one thing became certain. What started as a desperate wartime patch was about to shape the way the world would communicate from the skies forever. The following morning, London buzzed not with celebration, but with questions. How had one lone aircraft managed to return against all odds? Commanders at Allied High Command reviewed the scrambled mission logs, but the answer lay buried deep within a line of coded signal bursts logged in a small, locked drawer at Communications Bunker 17. Staff Sergeant Walter Reed had barely slept. He sat hunched over a fresh sheet of parchment, scribbling notes on what had just transpired. The signal had worked. Echolink had succeeded. Barely. But it had succeeded. And that single success lit a fire under the most secretive technology division of the Allied war effort. By noon, Reed was summoned to a briefing room miles from his station. He entered a dim-lit chamber filled with chalkboards, maps, and half-finished radio schematics. Standing at the head of the room was Colonel Diana Mason, a pioneer in signal warfare, and one of the few women trusted at the top of Allied military intelligence. She wasted no time. "What you pulled off last night, Sergeant," she began, "could change everything. But now we need to scale it. Fast." Her eyes narrowed as she laid out Operation Straylight, an initiative to outfit entire bomber wings with Echo Link units within 60 days. The only problem? The enemy had started to catch on. The Germans weren't deaf. Days prior, the Abwehr, the Nazi military intelligence, had detected anomalies in Allied radio transmissions. They couldn't decode them, not yet, but suspicions had been raised. Reed understood what that meant, a race against time. If the Axis figured out the pattern, they could not only jam the system, but mimic it, luring Allied planes into ambushes. That night, Reed and a select team of signal engineers were relocated to a remote airfield in East Anglia under round-the-clock protection. There, a lab was quickly built from hangar wreckage, equipped with nothing but surplus parts, raw copper wire, and field manuals. The challenge wasn't just building Echo Link, it was evolving it. As Reed worked, his mind wandered. He thought of the pilot from Eagle One, whose voice had cracked with desperation and hope. He never even saw the man's face, but he'd memorized every syllable of that broken transmission. That voice became his fuel. With each adjustment to the crystal oscillator, each rerouted wire, he imagined not saving one life, but thousands. And every click of the soldering iron was a strike against chaos. "If we fail," he whispered to a fellow technician, "we're not just losing radios, we're losing wings." Meanwhile, Colonel Mason coordinated airfield upgrades across Britain. New antennas, signal repeaters, encoded briefing scripts. Each step rolled out under complete blackout conditions. Not even the pilots knew the full extent of what they were using. And maybe that was for the best. Because if the Germans learned that the Allies were building a radio-based navigation system immune to their jamming, the countermeasures would come swiftly and ruthlessly. But for now, the skies remained quiet. And in that silence, a revolution in warfare was being forged. Not with bullets, but with frequencies. In the frigid dawn light of East Anglia, frost clung to the metal ribs of the improvised lab. Inside, Walter Reed's hands trembled, not from cold, but from exhaustion. It had been 72 hours since he last saw a bed. His makeshift desk was littered with schematic scraps and coffee-stained frequency maps. At the center lay the newest Echo Link prototype, now sleeker, faster, and capable of switching channels in less than half a second. It was the kind of innovation that didn't just defy jamming, it anticipated it. And that, Colonel Mason warned, would make them a target. News came from the continent. An Allied reconnaissance plane had vanished over the Ruhr Valley. No distress signal, no radar echo. Just silence. That silence felt like a warning. "They're probing us," Mason said during a classified briefing, her voice sharp, her eyes bloodshot. "They know something changed, and they're looking for our shadow." She tapped the chalkboard twice, where a single name was underlined: General Reinhard Zoller, head of German electronic warfare, brilliant, ruthless, and obsessed with radio intelligence. "If Zoller is listening," she warned, "he's already building something to listen back." Reed felt the pressure mount. Mason assigned him a contact, Dr. Clara Weiss, a Jewish-German physicist who had fled to Britain in 1938. Clara had once worked under Zoller in Berlin, before she disappeared. She arrived in silence, her eyes scanning the lab like a surgeon prepping for war. Without a word, she picked up a coil, examined Reed's oscillator, and muttered, "Too slow." Over the next 48 hours, she transformed Echo Link's design, compressing signal encryption, shielding against directional tracking, and introducing a pulse shift modulator so advanced it bordered on future science. Reed watched in awe. "You're building a ghost," he whispered. She simply nodded. But Clara wasn't just brilliant. She was haunted. Late at night, when the lab fell quiet, Reed overheard her reciting German names under her breath. Names of scientists, prisoners, family. It became clear. For Clara, this wasn't just a war, it was revenge. One night, over solder fumes, she finally spoke. "Zoller killed my brother, with a radio signal." Reed didn't ask how. He didn't need to. They both understood that in this war, even static could bleed. By week's end, the upgraded Echo Link was ready for a field test. A squadron of 4 Lancaster bombers would fly a simulated mission over northern France. One of them would carry the new system. The other 3 would use standard navigation. The objective? Precision flyover of a target zone under full blackout. Reed handed the final transmitter to the pilot with a shaky smile. "This won't just guide you," he said. "It'll hide you." The man looked skeptical, but nodded. As the engines roared and the bombers lifted into the fog, Reed stepped outside, headphones pressed tight. In the background static, he heard it. A faint digital heartbeat. Echo Link was alive. But so was the enemy. And somewhere across the channel, Reinhard Zoller was listening too. Across the channel, deep within a bunker beneath the Harz Mountains, General Reinhard Zoller lit a cigarette with practiced indifference. The thick scent of tobacco masked the ozone stench of overheating valves and copper dust. He stood before a wall of signal intercepts, fragments of Allied chatter, encrypted pulses, bursts of static too clean to be accidental. "They've built something," he muttered. His analysts watched silently as Zoller ran a gloved finger over the waveform. "British engineering," he said, then paused. "No, this is Clara's work." Zoller hadn't forgotten Clara Weiss. She'd once been his most promising assistant, her mind sharp enough to reshape how Berlin tracked Allied frequencies. But she had vanished days before the purge began, just as he prepared to militarize his prototype of Stille Ohr, the silent ear. And now she was speaking again, not with words, but through the signal patterns of a machine only she could have touched. He felt it, her signature. "She's hiding them," he whispered, almost amused. How poetic. Inside that same bunker, his new project came to life. Feuerstein, he called it. Firestone. A pulse interceptor, designed not only to detect Echolink's encrypted waves, but to mimic them, bouncing false coordinates into Allied ears. Zoller ES' ambition wasn't to jam their signals. It was to turn their own system against them. They trust the machine more than their eyes, he told his engineers. So let's feed the machine lies. His staff scrambled under his command, adapting captured parts, scanning every possible frequency deviation, while listening for that rhythmic pulse he now recognized like a heartbeat. Meanwhile, back in East Anglia, the Lancaster squadron returned. Of the 4 planes, 3 reported erratic navigation. Only the Echo Link-equipped aircraft completed its course flawlessly. Reed and Clara celebrated cautiously. "It works," she said flatly, brushing solder from her coat. But even as she spoke, Reed saw her face tighten. "That was too clean," she added. "Too easy." She suspected what Reed feared. Zoller had heard them, and he wouldn't answer with silence. 2 nights later, the lab's receivers crackled with a familiar pulse. But something was wrong. The rhythm was nearly perfect, but subtly distorted. A frequency fraction was off by a hair. Reed froze. "He's copying us." Clara's expression turned pale. "No," she whispered. "He's inviting us." A decoded burst revealed coordinates over northern Belgium. An abandoned Luftwaffe field. A trap? A test? Or something more sinister? Colonel Mason called an emergency briefing. The top brass wanted answers. "Do we follow the signal?" she asked. Reed glanced at Clara, who remained silent. Then he looked at the frequency printout again. Zoller's ghost signal, beckoning them forward. "We built a machine to vanish," Reed said. "He built one to echo us." Mason's response was ice cold. "Then let S see who hears the truth louder." The decision was made. The mission was on. Night fell over Belgium with an unnatural stillness. A thin fog clung to the abandoned airfield, stretching across cracked tarmac like a warning. In the cockpit of the lead Lancaster, Flight Lieutenant Dennis Ward stared at the horizon. His orders were clear. Investigate the location transmitted by the distorted Echo Link signal. But even at altitude, with the moon bleeding silver across the clouds, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Inside the operations van, Clara Weiss sat in silence, headphones pressed tight to her ears. Her fingers danced across the dials, adjusting gain, isolating spikes. The frequency Zoller used was nearly flawless. Only a subtle warble in the carrier wave betrayed its falsehood. "He's watching our responses," she murmured to Reed. "This isn't a test, it's a performance. He wants to see how far we'll follow the ghost he built." Reed said nothing, staring at the blinking transmission light like it was about to blink back. Meanwhile, in Berlin, General Zoller leaned back as the first real-time intercepts came through. "They took the bait," he said with a smile. His engineers stood at attention, watching a wall of blinking lights and oscilloscopes that confirmed it. The British had followed his phantom. "Let's make them regret their faith in machines." With a flick of his wrist, he initiated Phase 2. Feuerstein would now feed false radar echoes into the British signal chain, fabricating enemy squadrons, rerouting Allied paths, breaking formation through nothing but invisible lies. The deception worked. On board the second Lancaster, confusion reigned. Their radar operator saw phantom blips, dozens of them. "Flak towers at 2 o'clock, he yelled. "Pull north." But there was nothing. No towers, no flak. Just empty fields and mist. In the confusion, the squadron veered from their path, drifting dangerously close to an actual German reconnaissance patrol just outside Antwerp. A moment later, searchlights lanced the sky. Sirens wailed. In the van, Clara's eyes widened. The Echo Link map glitched, units disappearing, reappearing out of range. "He's inside the loop," she said sharply. "He's modifying our output as it happens. He's not intercepting us. He's writing over us." Reed grabbed the emergency radio. "All units abort the mission. Revert to analog fallback." But the skies were already burning. A German 88mm shell clipped the wing of the third Lancaster. A plume of fire spiraled into the fog. Back in Berlin, Zoller watched the chaos unfold through silent transmissions. He leaned closer to his engineer and whispered, "Let them see what blind faith in circuits brings." Clara gave them a voice. "Let me show them silence." But deep down, he knew this was more than strategy. It was personal. A battle not for victory, but for legacy. For who would write the future? Those who built the signal, or those who could twist it? The emergency landing zone outside Brussels was a desolate strip of farmland lit only by the glow of burning wreckage in the distance. Clara Weiss stood outside the mobile command truck, eyes locked on the static-riddled monitor, hands trembling not from cold, but rage. The Echo Link had been her creation, her vision of a war won by precision and coordination. But now it was being used against them, twisted, corrupted, and she knew exactly who was behind it. Inside the van, Reed barked orders into the analog backup radio, trying to reach the scattered bomber crews. "We've lost 2 aircraft. Third one's off course. Fourth, no response." His voice cracked under the weight of failure. Clara stepped back inside, eyes blazing. "He didn't just mimic us. He anticipated our fallback protocols. He's 3 moves ahead." Reed looked at her. "Then we need to catch up." But catching up meant doing something reckless. Clara opened her notebook, the original hand-sketched version of Echo Link's core encoding system. "If I isolate the carrier frequency and reintroduce a secondary harmonic scrambler, I can re-authenticate the signal chain," she said. "He won't see it coming. It's analog inside digital, like hiding a horse in plain sight." Reed hesitated. "You're talking about a blind broadcast. No targeting, no location verification. It could hit friendlies." Clara met his gaze. "Or it could save every remaining bomber in the sky." Meanwhile, in Berlin, Zoller was already celebrating. "Their fallback systems are primitive," he told his aides. "Tubes and knobs. They'll think analog is safety, but analog is predictable." He turned toward a fresh map printout from his decoding unit. The British bombers were now off formation and heading toward a decoy industrial zone. Empty warehouses and dummy factories built to lure Allied payloads away from critical targets. "Tonight," he grinned, "they'll waste their fire on shadows." Clara's fingers flew across the transmitter array. "Patching now," she said. "New protocol. Code name, Ghost Lantern." She injected a scrambled frequency into the Echo Link channel, one that no German interceptor could make sense of. It mimicked static, background noise, a signal that didn't exist on paper. Then she broadcast a single phrase: "Switch to shadow mode, echo off." The words meant nothing to the Germans, but to British pilots trained in Clara's codebooks, it was everything. Above, in the clouds streaked with fire, the lead pilot of the last undamaged Lancaster caught the phrase, "Shadow mode. Roger that." He flipped a sequence of switches, disabling his radar guidance and switching to a previously unused navigational chart, one inked by hand and sealed in an envelope weeks ago. Within minutes, the surviving squadron shifted course, disappearing from Zoller's predicted flight paths. In Berlin, the signals blinked out. Zoller stared at the void in confusion. "Where did they go?" he muttered. But Clara wasn't done yet. She initiated the second part of Ghost Lantern, a recursive feedback loop in the German relay. Suddenly, Zoller's own system lit up with false signals. Dozens of Allied planes, none real, appeared heading straight for Berlin. Clara allowed herself one breath of satisfaction. Let's see how he handles a phantom war. The command bunker beneath Berlin's Tiergarten trembled with activity. Zoller's analysts scrambled across consoles, tracking the ghost fleet bearing down on the capital. Sirens echoed through the corridors as air defense units were ordered into position. Anti-aircraft guns roared to life, manned by soldiers staring at empty skies. Zoller stood at the heart of the storm, jaw clenched. Something didn't add up. The signal strength was off. The formations were too perfect. And worst of all, there had been no engine noise overhead. At that very moment, Clara Weiss stood by the British mobile relay outside Brussels, her headset crackling softly. "Ghost Lantern is holding," she whispered, barely audible over the ambient static. "They're chasing shadows." Reed leaned forward, disbelief turning into awe. "You tricked their entire air command into defending the wrong city?" Clara shook her head. "I didn't trick them. I taught them to see ghosts, and now they're fighting them." The surviving British bombers, no longer targeted by radar-guided fire, adjusted course toward their true destination, the heavily fortified refinery at Bielefeld. That refinery was one of the Reich's last remaining sources of aviation fuel. If it fell, Germany's long-range air response would crumble. The mission had become even more critical than when it was first conceived. Now, with Zoller's radar net chasing phantoms, Clara's gambit had opened a fragile window of attack. Back underground, Zoller reviewed the spectrum logs. These pulses, they're echoing on frequencies no longer used by Allied forces, he muttered. Then it hit him. Analog. Clara had layered ancient transmission formats into her deception. Signals that looked like background radiation unless you knew exactly what to look for. She built a ghost army, he growled. She's rewriting the rules. He stormed out of the control room and into the private analysis chamber where only the most trusted aides were allowed. I want every signal audited. Cross-reference each Phantom aircraft with known Allied deployments. If even one doesn't match, we assume it's a decoy. One of his aides hesitated. Sir, that'll take hours. Then don't stop working, Zoller snapped. Because if I've lost Berlin to a mirage, then I'm fighting the wrong war. At 02:19 a.m., the British bombers reached Bielefeld. No flak, no night fighters, no resistance. The refinery lay beneath them like a sleeping giant. Within minutes, explosives rained down in a precise cascade. Clara listened in near silence as the mission frequency confirmed. Objective destroyed. Survivors returning. A long exhale escaped her lips. Relief, sorrow, fatigue all at once. She knew the cost. 3 aircraft had gone down before Ghost Lantern activated. Lives lost, but hundreds saved, and perhaps thousands more spared by cutting the refinery's lifeline. The war had shifted because of misdirection, code, and a machine designed not to kill, but to communicate. As dawn crept across the European sky, Clara looked west toward the dim glow of London. She didn't smile. She rarely did. But in that moment, she whispered, "One message can win a war." The debris of the Bielefeld refinery still smoked when Allied command received confirmation of the mission's success. Back in London, the war room erupted in applause, except for Reed, who sat still, eyes fixed on the radio. "What else can she do?" he muttered. Clara Weiss had done more than spoof enemy radar. She had weaponized uncertainty, and now the Allies wanted more. At the hidden field station in Belgium, Clara worked in silence. Her hands trembled slightly as she rewound magnetic tape, preparing the next wave of signal deception. She hadn't slept in 2 days. Her ears rang from endless hours of interference and humming circuits. The equipment was overheating. Her own body felt like a flickering wire, stretched, taut, and ready to snap. Yet she pressed on. She knew the Reich would counter, and fast. Meanwhile, deep in Berlin, Zoller had turned paranoid. He dismissed half his command staff, accusing them of collusion or incompetence. He replaced his radar officers with mathematicians and cryptanalysts. "If Weiss is distorting our machines," he told his new staff, "we must think like her. Forget radar. Focus on behavior, pattern, rhythm." He launched an operation called Echo Chain, designed to map the Allied radio web by feeding back its own frequencies. If she builds illusions, we'll set traps within them. Across the front, Allied pilots began reporting eerie warnings. German flak guns now responding before radar detection. Radio bursts disrupting formation signals. Some aircraft vanished mid-flight, rerouted by false coordinates. The wire war had entered a second phase: sabotage. Clara knew immediately that Zoller was adapting. She could feel it in the static. "He's talking back now," she told Reed, holding up the intercepted pulse. "He's using my code against me." Reed leaned forward. "Then we pull you out. You've done enough. London says you've earned the medal. You'll be remembered." Clara shook her head. "If we stop now, he owns the sky. No, I want him to hear something he can't ignore. A sound he can't trace, but won't dare overlook." She pulled out a box of phonograph records, coded recordings of battlefield noise, Morse overlays, and scrambled chatter from Normandy. "We're going to build a symphony of ghosts." She called it Operation Requiem, a full-scale audio mirage that would convince the Reich a massive offensive was forming in southern France, far from where Allied troops would actually land. Zoller, hearing the false crescendo, would move his air squadrons south, leaving northern France vulnerable in the weeks to come. It was Clara's final game. One last trick of light and sound. As the first notes of Requiem crackled to life over long-wave transmission, Clara stepped outside into the cold. Her face pale, lips cracked, mind weary, but eyes sharp. The war wasn't won, but in the war of wires and whispers, she had turned noise into a weapon, and silence into a strategy. And once again, the machines were listening. The French countryside was unusually quiet that week. In a small Allied operations van parked outside Avignon, signals pulsed through massive antennae disguised as hay bales and farmhouse chimneys. Inside, Clara Weiss adjusted dials with the focus of a surgeon. A low hum vibrated through the floor. This was Requiem's heart, an orchestra of deception, broadcasting panic into the ears of the Reich. The frequencies were carefully layered: static-laced air raid sirens, false squadron codes, Morse pulses embedded with military jargon. They mimicked troop buildups, aircraft movements, even false transmissions between non-existent Allied generals. Each sound crafted a picture of chaos in southern France. It was art, masquerading as strategy. Clara wasn't just jamming signals, she was sculpting them into fear. Reed stood behind her, his arms crossed, face lined with concern. "You realize this is it?" he said. "Once they bite, there's no turning back." Clara didn't look up. "They'll bite," she answered. "Zoller thinks in probabilities. We've stacked the odds high enough to tip him over." A map on the wall displayed flashing pins. German divisions moving south, Luftwaffe squadrons being redeployed away from Normandy. The bluff was working, but the risk was enormous. If the Germans discovered Requiem was a ruse, Operation Overlord, the real invasion, could be a bloodbath. The fate of thousands now hung on Clara's illusion, and Zoller wasn't fooled easily. From his command center in Berlin, he analyzed every signal. He ordered reconnaissance flights, sent ground patrols to southern France, interrogated captured Allied soldiers. And still, all evidence pointed to Avignon. Then, on the eve of D-Day, Clara received a transmission, short, encoded, unmistakably German. "We hear your drums. We've sent our wolves." Zoller had taken the bait. Entire divisions were on the move. Northern France was exposed. Reed turned to Clara, eyes wide. "He's gone. He really moved them." She allowed herself a rare smile. Then, it's time for silence. At midnight, Clara shut down Requiem. The hum stopped. The countryside was still again. In its place, real invasion orders passed quietly along secure Allied channels. Ships were loading. Paratroopers were boarding planes. The storm was coming, but in the Reich's ears, it would arrive from the wrong direction. Clara leaned back in her chair, exhausted. She had played her final card. There would be no more false signals, no more ghost battalions. From here forward, it would be steel, fire, and blood. The kind of truth even radios couldn't twist. Outside, the wind rustled the wheat fields. The last whisper of requiem faded into the night sky, and across the channel, the Allied invasion fleet set sail, shrouded not in fog, but in silence, carefully engineered by a woman who had turned war into music and deception into a masterpiece. The beaches of Normandy erupted with thunder on June 6, 1944. As Allied forces stormed the coastline, the German southern defenses remained eerily quiet. Tanks and divisions, misled by Clara Weiss's phantom transmissions, were hundreds of miles away, out of position, too late to intervene. The success of the invasion wasn't merely won by firepower, but by frequencies, crafted lies that traveled invisibly through the air. In Berlin, Zoller stood in silence before a wall of empty signal tapes. He had reviewed them a dozen times. "How could they have vanished?" he muttered. "Where did the transmissions go?" There were no more false battalions to trace, no more ghost commanders issuing phony orders. Requiem had gone dark. The greatest deception of the war had played its final note. Meanwhile, in London, General Eisenhower read the decrypted field reports from the front with a steady hand. He knew the statistics. German reinforcements to the north had been delayed by nearly 48 hours. That window, carved by Clara's transmission work, had saved tens of thousands of lives. He circled her name on the intelligence summary. "Never fired a bullet," he said to his aide, "but saved more men than any rifle ever could." Clara sat alone in a transport back to England. Her fingers, still bandaged from the last-minute reconfiguration of Requiem, traced the edge of a decoded German message in her lap. It was Zoller's last transmission. "We hear your drums." She folded it into her coat pocket, a silent trophy of a war fought not with guns, but with frequencies, static, and the theater of sound. The war raged on for months. Paris was liberated, the Reich began to collapse, and the world would eventually see peace again. But the legacy of Requiem didn't fade. The tapes and control panels were boxed, archived, and quietly transferred, not to a museum, but to a hidden division of British intelligence. The machine's principles, its algorithms, its logic circuits, became the foundation of something new. Years later, in a lab at Cambridge, a group of young engineers puzzled over early digital pattern recognition. Among their references, operational notes from Requiem, with Clara's handwriting still on the margins. What she had built under the pressure of war became a framework for the emerging field of artificial intelligence. Clara never returned to intelligence work. She married a radio technician, raised a family, and refused interviews. But each time a radar system tracked a storm, or a modern drone interpreted enemy movement autonomously, her legacy quietly echoed. At the Imperial War Museum decades later, a small exhibit featured a rusted terminal from the Requiem system. Few visitors understood its true significance. Beneath the display, a quote was engraved in brass. "She changed the war without firing a shot, and shaped the future without knowing it." And so, the machine born in shadows, built for deception, became the silent ancestor of technologies that would guide aircraft, decode languages, and someday think for themselves. A final broadcast from WWII, still echoing through the circuits of today.